For 27 years, they listened in silence. Their calls crossed oceans before reaching their own people, and when they protested, the lines were cut. In 2021, a 72-hour blackout in Burkina Faso tore families apart, paralyzed rural clinics, and reminded a nation of who held the power to silence them. No bombs were dropped, no soldiers marched, just silence armed. But one August morning, in the dry heat of Ouagadougou, a soldier stepped forward. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not wait for applause. He did not ask for permission. He simply stepped to the microphone and declared, "From this day forward, the voice of our people will not leave this continent before it reaches our neighbor." That moment changed everything, because this is not just about telecommunications. It is about sovereignty, dignity, and digital freedom carved into the red soil of Africa. So what does it mean for a landlocked nation, long forgotten, long delayed, to build its own signal? Follow us, because this is not just another story. It is the future our ancestors dreamed of. Sign up and join us for an Africa without bows. 27 years of control. They said it was just a network, just cables, just satellites, just a service. But for 27 years, those services decide who could speak and who could be silenced. From the day Burkina Faso signed its first telecom license in the late 1990s, control never truly rested in Burkinabe hands. The cables were French, the data flowed through Paris, and the decisions about speed, censorship, shutdown came from boardrooms thousands of miles away. At first, it was subtle. Dropped calls during protests, unexplained outages during sensitive votes, delays in rural installations no one can explain. But in 2021, the illusion of control shattered. For 72 hours, a full 3 days, the signal disappeared. Hospitals lost access to emergency consultations. Farms missed rainfall alerts. Children couldn't connect to distant learning centers. And for the elderly, like Papa Doumbia in the remote province of Yaga, it meant total isolation. "I didn't know if my daughter in the capital was alive," he later told the press. "For 3 days, we were voiceless." But the silence spoke volumes. It revealed a truth many had suspected. Burkina Faso's voice was not its own. For a generation raised on satellite promises and cell towers with foreign logos, this wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a revelation, a realization that the wires beneath their feet belonged to someone else, and that someone else had the power to unplug them at will. It wasn't just the blackout, it was the arrogance that followed. When pressed, the foreign operators cited technical malfunctions. When challenged by civil society, they shed off responsibility, even as documents leaked later showed internal emails discussing stability concerns tied to anti-government protests. It was censorship without fingerprints, control without accountability, and it wasn't new. For years, activists reported messages disappearing before delivery. Journalists noticed slow speeds near election cycles. Entire villages had to climb hills for a signal, while mining companies operated with perfect coverage. The contradiction was naked. Burkina Faso had signed contracts, but never consented to control. What the people were sold as partnerships were, in truth, chains. And slowly, the public began to ask dangerous questions. Why must our voices pass through Paris to reach Ouagadougou? Why must our data be hosted in Europe, in languages we do not speak, on systems we do not audit? Each question added weight. Each blackout etched the memory deeper. Each drop signal became a drumbeat of discontent. And like the elders in the movement once said, when enough silence is forced upon a person, their first word back is a shout. That shout will come. But first came the reminder, the reckoning, and the quiet resolves. Never again. The rise of Faso Telecom. He did not call for tenders. He did not wait for loans. He did not send a delegation to Brussels or sign a memorandum of understanding in Washington. Captain Ibrahim Traoré simply stood before the nation and said, "The lines must be ours. The voice must be ours. The future must be ours." And so began the most audacious infrastructure project in Burkina Faso's modern history. Not because of its size, but because of what it challenged. Faso Telecom was not a foreign initiative. It was not another French-led upgrade. It was not a Chinese-backed pilot project. For the first time, It was a Burkina Faso dream, designed on Burkina Faso soil, with a Burkina Faso mind, and built by Burkina Faso hands. No IMF loans, no World Bank credit lines, no European grants. Instead, they redirected the country's resources. Military bases that once housed foreign troops were closed. Royalties from gold mines, long siphoned off the coast, were renegotiated and retained. And in 2023, the country established its first telecom sovereignty fund, a fund built from licensing fees previously paid to foreign operators. From that fund, telecom towers rose, not glass towers in the capital, but steel signal towers in forgotten districts. Zorma, Djibo, Bitu, places that had never known reliable service, saw engineers in dusty boots arriving with cables on their backs and fire in their eyes. 200 kilometers of fiber optic cables, weaving through mountains, dry riverbeds, minefields, and rebel corridors. 65 satellite relay stations, designed, built, and calibrated entirely within Burkina Faso's borders. Each station is reinforced to withstand the heat of the Sahel. Each relay node is dust-free. Each cooling unit is made from local materials, adjusting to unpredictable changes in the climate. The workforce is surprisingly young. Of the 647 engineers and technicians deployed across the country, 83% are under 35. Their mission was urgent, not just logistically but also spiritually. "We had no plan B," says Aissatou Zida, a leading cryptographer. Failure would mean another generation growing up dependent. And so they wrote their own code. They built their own firewalls. They developed their own encryption algorithms, proprietary, secure, and stored in a Tier 4 data center west of the capital. That data center could handle 5 million simultaneous connections, more than the entire population of Ouagadougou. But the numbers only tell part of the story. More important is what the project rejected. It rejected surveillance disguised as aid. It rejected dependency marketed as development. It rejected the quiet belief that Africa must wait its turn, ask permission. And instead, Faso Telecom delivered something else: a sovereign line, a sovereign signal, a sovereign future. From dusty classrooms to rural clinics, from market stalls to ministry buildings, the country began to throb. A network, not borrowed, but born. And as one elder in Dori whispered during a test call to his grandson in the capital, "For the first time in my life, the line is working." And so is the message. This is more than a convenience. It was a statement. Captain Ibrahim's latest news is no longer about that man. It's about the millions of people who were impacted by his decision. Millions of people who are now, at last, able to speak for themselves. International response. The cables were barely cooled when the tremors began. In Paris, executives at TASA, the French telecom giant that once ruled Burkina Faso's digital spine, watched as their operational license was revoked. Within hours, their stock plunged. In Luxembourg, Helionet Group, a quiet but powerful player, filed for arbitration, demanding $276 million in damages. Their claim: disruption of regional business continuity. Burkina Faso's reply: we will not negotiate the return of what was always ours. It wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reframing of the question itself. Not who owns the network, but why did they ever? In Brussels, EU trade officials called emergency consultations. In Washington, analysts at the Commerce Department flagged Faso Telecom as a strategic development. Cybersecurity attachments were dispatched across the Sahel, and France, the former colonial overseer, quietly increased cyber operations in the region. The Western world wasn't just reacting to infrastructure, they were reacting to a precedent. Because if one landlocked country could break free of the digital grip, who would be next? Meanwhile, the media scrambled to shape the narrative. The Guardian warns of unregulated state control. CNN Africa asked if centralization might breed censorship. The Economist poses a more cynical query: can Burkina Faso be trusted with its own data? But across Africa, the conversation was different. In Dar es Salaam, It was dubbed the first diplomat firewall. In Accra, opposition MPs asked why Ghana couldn't do the same. In Johannesburg, talk shows debated the risks of sovereignty versus the cost of silence. And in Nairobi, editorials capture the mood best. This is no longer about who built the towers. It's about who holds the keys. Burkina Faso latest news was no longer just about a network. It was about a continent watching, calculating, and asking if they can do it. What's stopping us? Changing civil lives. Revolutions aren't always loud. Sometimes they whisper through voices that finally reach. The week Faso Telecom went live, there were no fireworks lighting up the sky. There were no marching bands. But something much bigger happened. A farmer got a weather report just in time to save his crops. A grandmother in Kaya video called her son for the first time. A child in a dusty school asked a question and got an answer. Change happened quietly, but everywhere. In the rural highlands, children no longer have to walk miles to get a phone signal. They logged into FosoLearn, a solar-powered platform built on local codes in their own dialect. Assignments are graded in real time. Progress is tracked not on paper, but on secure national servers in Monga. In clinics far from city hospitals, nurses now consult with specialists hundreds of miles away. Calls are encrypted and uncensored by third parties. A nurse in Tenkodogo put it well. We no longer have to ask for permission from Paris to save a child's life. Farmers, who previously relied on unreliable radio chats, now receive push notifications based on domestic satellite data forecasts tailored to their villages, their crops, their seasons. Even religious leaders have begun sending encrypted newsletters, reaching nomadic groups in seconds. What used to take days by post now arrives in style, without delay, without the need for foreign servers, and people noticed. They noticed that when service was interrupted, it came back faster. They noticed that when they called government offices, the lines didn't drop. They noticed that the voice on the other end wasn't just clearer, it was theirs. This wasn't just speed or coverage. This was psychological infrastructure. It reconnected something deeper, a belief that they were no longer guests on their own network. The line is ours now. The words began to resonate at market stalls, on mosque steps, in mothers' meetings. Young engineers, once laid off, now walked with more dignity, knowing that the laws that ran the country were running through their fingers. Officials began to write policy confidently, not as supplicants. Activists planned movements on platforms free from foreign surveillance. Villages began to rely on online systems for health registration, school enrollment, even local voting trials. It wasn't perfect. There weren't traffic lights on every corner, but it was theirs, and that made all the difference. As one elder put it under a solar mast in Tugan, we no longer worry about our voice being cut off. We know who to call if it breaks, and he mentioned our names, from the capital to the border. The effect was negated. Connectivity was no longer a vulnerability. It was a synonym for ownership. And that ownership, that sacred sense of this is ours, will prove more powerful than any satellite antenna money can buy. Geopolitical shift. Burkina Faso didn't just change cables, it changed posture. For decades, the nation had sat at the periphery of digital diplomacy, treated as a client, a consumer, an afterthought. But with Faso Telecom, it became something else. A sovereign node in a disputed global grid, no longer dependent, no longer deferential, and the world took notice. Within weeks, Burkina Faso's delegates at the African Union stood taller in negotiation halls. Their votes on cyber frameworks, spectrum allocations, and cross-border bandwidth treaties carried new weight. Not because of size, but because of what they represent. Other nations began to pivot. India and Indonesia sent quiet inquiries interested in the technical structure and legal frameworks behind the sovereignty model. Ghana's opposition MPs raised formal motions asking why their infrastructure still relies on legacy contracts. Niger's new digital ministry began conducting experimental studies, citing Faso Telecom by name. Meanwhile, foreign corporations were forced to adapt. Cloud service providers, once confident of default dominance, now had to comply with Burkina Faso audit laws, undergo local security checks, and submit to data localization rules. European software giants suddenly found themselves invited only as observers, not architects. Development donors, used to set terms, were offered seats at the back, not the table. The shift was deeper than regulation. It was psychological. For the first time, negotiation began from a place of ownership. No need. Contracts were reviewed with sovereignty as the starting clause, not the final plea. And within the country, the political class adjusted. Even opposing parties wary of state power could not deny the public support behind Faso Telecom. They raised concerns about centralization. Yes, but no one dared suggest going back because the benefits were too visible, too real. What had once been a dream had become a baseline, a new normal, and that baseline redefined what development looked like. It wasn't about how much foreign aid arrived. It was about how much national voice stayed. Diplomatically, this recalibrated Burkina Faso's leverage. They didn't threaten. They didn't boast. They simply said, "Our signal cannot be shut off by anyone but us." And in an increasingly wired world, that sentence landed heavier than any tank. Captain Ibrahim's latest news now filled not just African headlines, but security briefings in Western capitals. Because if sovereignty could be coded, who else might choose to write their own? It didn't end with a press release, or a ribbon cutting, or a corporate rebrand. It ended and began with something simpler. A voice speaking clearly from one Burkina Faso soul to another without leaving the continent. Because this was never just about signal strength. It was about signal ownership, about deciding who gets to speak and who gets to listen. Faso Telecom was more than infrastructure. It was inheritance, the reclaiming of what should never have been leased. A line drawn not just in code, but in conviction. And for a generation who remembered the days of silence, of waiting, of watching their country routed through foreign switches, it meant something sacred. We are no longer on someone else's network. We are no longer asking. We are building. And so the questions begin not in fear, but in clarity. What if Congo builds next? What if Namibia writes its own code? What if Africa's voice never has to leave Africa again? If this story moved something in your chest, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because they hid our history long enough. Let's speak our future out loud. Captain Ibrahim's latest news is not a headline. It's a call, a blueprint, a promise that what began in Burkina Faso does not have to end there. Because independence today is not just about land. It's about bandwidth. It's about encryption. It's about who holds the keys to the towers we build. So let them ask their questions. Let them file their lawsuits. Let them doubt. Burkina Faso has already answered. And to that, we say, Africa rise. Thank you for being here. We'll see you in the next story, the kind they still don't want you to hear.